Good evening. We are live. Thanks very much for attending the Standards Committee. I'm going to start off with the usual beginning. If we've got any apologies for absence, I've been told in advance we've got apologies from Councillor Feeney, and Councillor Ellis is substituting his absence. Do we have any other apologies? If not, excellent. We'll move through. So item 2 is the minutes of the Standards Committee from the 20th of March. Any comments, corrections from the floor? No? In which case then I'll propose and ask if there's a second. Councillor Smith, thank you very much. And then take a vote from anyone who's there to approve the minutes. I think that's passed. Any objections? Or abstentions? Just one for Councillor Ellis. Thank you. They are approved. Item number 3, any declaration of interests needed today? Nope. Excellent. And then we're on to agenda item number 4, which is the enhanced DBS checks for councillors, report from the Deputy Chief Executive and the Monitoring Officer. And I'm going to hand over to Fran to introduce the paper. Thank you.
Thank you. So, as members will be aware, there was a motion agreed at Council in January 2025, a motion with an amendment that, in essence, the Council would like to see all elected councillors undergoing enhanced DBS checks, the cost of that to be met by the Council. It was recognised that in light of the independent Bailey review and subsequent letters to council leaders, that further consideration needed to be given to this by the Standards Committee, who were then asked to consider a policy and procedure document and report back to council. We touched on this subject at the committee meeting in March, and it was agreed that in order to explore this further, a working group would be put together to look at the intricacies in the legal position around DBS checks for councillors. That working group has subsequently met, and the policy document that you see attached to the report was pulled together in agreement with that working group. So just a very quick summary of the background. I'm conscious there's a lot of detail in the report before you, but just to kind of explain where we have got to. Further looking into this issue, the Bailey review was very specifically focused on unitary and upper tier authorities where there were social services or childcare service functions. And it was accepted that for councillors engaging in decisions around children and vulnerable adults, that enhanced DBS checks was recommended as coming out of that review. Upper tier authorities, including Nottinghamshire County Council, have followed and require enhanced DBS checks for their councillors. There are, as set out in the report, 4 different levels of disclosure and barring services checks. There is a basic check, a standard check, an enhanced check, and an enhanced check with a check of the barred lists. Now, those different types of checks require different sort of checks and filters before they can be applied for. So a basic check, which shows unspent convictions and conditional cautions. There are no eligibility requirements for such a check, and any applicant can request a DBS check for themselves if they want to. A standard check is specifically linked to certain types of professions or job roles that are listed in statute that would require those or could have those types of checks. An enhanced check is a higher check again. It shows the same as a standard check plus any information held by local police that's considered relevant to a particular role. And there are eligibility requirements for an enhanced check. An enhanced check with a check of the barred list goes even further and shows whether the applicant is on the adults barred list or children's barred list or both. And again, there are legal eligibility requirements for this level of check. On looking at those eligibility requirements set out within the statute, it became clear, and it was accepted when we discussed it at the working group, that none of the eligibility requirements apply to work that is carried out by district councillors at this level. So those specific activities that would require an enhanced check around working with vulnerable adults and children are not provided for within the legislation. So as a registered body, which the council is, who would conduct DBS checks for people who are applying for jobs or people who are volunteering in some instances, or indeed we'd carry them out in relation to taxi driving, councillors do not fit, or at a district level do not fit those criteria. For this reason, and conscious that we still wanted to ensure that there was some follow through from the motion, and that the intention of the motion that was put forward in the chamber was investigated and carried through, the policy has been drafted around having a basic check and all councillors undergoing a basic DBS check, which the council will pay for. As set out within the policy, it sets out how that process will apply if that document is agreed, and that's that those checks would be carried out within, the applications for the checks would be carried out within 2 months of the policy coming into effect, or within 2 months of any new councillor being elected through the process of a by-election. The results of those checks would be kept by myself as the monitoring officer. They would be kept secure in line with data protection and the code of practice around disclosure and barring checks. And only when there is any issue arising from those DBS checks would there be any need for that to be discussed or any potential actions considered. Also, to be very clear on this, there are already legislative requirements in place around when a councillor can stand for election, and when a councillor can be disqualified from holding position as a councillor. And that is a separate piece of legislation. So if a councillor were to be convicted and it triggered one of the offences within that legislation, so I believe it's a 3-month prison sentence or more, or certain other types of sexually related offences, then automatically that councillor would be under the law disqualified from being a councillor. So to be very clear, the DBS checks, the basic checks, this is something that councillors would have to agree to undertake almost on a voluntary basis. But the policy does make it quite clear that if this policy is accepted, if a councillor were to fail to have the basic DBS check, that could amount to potentially a breach of or an investigation under the Code of Conduct, because the Code of Conduct does require councillors to comply with relevant policies. So in terms of sanctions, I suppose that's how non-compliance with the policy or non-compliance with the checks, I suppose, would be measured and assessed. So I think that pretty much covers everything. I'm happy to answer any questions if there's anything missing from within the report that you feel needs further clarification.
I'll open it to the floor for any questions. Councillor Howard.
Thank you, Chair. Just one thought that springs to mind, and I'm presuming it's being considered. Obviously, as a council, we don't deal with social services and vulnerable adults and children as such. But the one area that perhaps would impinge would the youth council. Would that be something that would? Was that considered maybe at the working group? I don't know whether that was the one aspect I did wonder, was perhaps there could be some sort of issue with that possibly.
Yeah. If I may, Chair, in relation to the youth council, so it isn't. There is councillors can attend it, as can members of the public. It's not necessarily facilitated by councillors. It's attended by the youth council and it's administered by officers. The portfolio holder does attend. But in terms of regulated activity relating to children, it does set out quite specifically what that entails. So it's about whether that contact's unsupervised, the length of time that contact is for. What I haven't done, I think it's fair to say, is done an individual risk assessment on every single role, but broadly speaking, there is no unsupervised contact with children as part of that process. And whilst councillors may well, attend schools or something sometimes in that line of presentation, they're not, again, it's not kind of unsupervised contact, it's under specific roles or responsibilities. But certainly, broadly speaking, there isn't anything that we could see that would specifically fit under those regulated activities.
Councillor Ellis.
Thank you. And I would be interested to hear your view. One of the things that a councillor might be asked to do is conduct a home visit and go and see one of their residents regarding an issue. That resident might be a vulnerable adult. What would be your perspective on that?
Honestly, without going through every single activity under the Act, because there are blanket activities, I suppose the question is, does that happen? So again, what we could take the time to do, absolutely, is to go through every single councillor and exactly what their roles entail to assess whether for that particular councillor they are engaging in activities which would satisfy regulated activity under the Act. But that's very bespoke, I suppose, depending on the individual councillor and their individual role. As an authority, as a council, and the roles that you're providing at a district level, we wouldn't necessarily expect that there is kind of these regulated activities occurring. That's not to say it absolutely isn't. That, you know, I don't know exactly what every individual councillor does, but there are specific requirements, as I say, particularly in relation to children, particularly regulated activity. But there are criteria around, as I say, whether it's as part of the job, whether it's unsupervised, the length of time that is spent there, and so on and so forth.
Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, thank you to everybody who's put so much hard work into this, and I'm pretty confident that it's all going to be approved both tonight and in full council. But why is there a delay of 2 months? What's the rationale behind delaying it for 2 months, or applying for the DBS after the implementation of this, or hopeful implementation?
It doesn't have to be 2 months, I suppose. That's for applying for it, because what we're conscious of is that DBS checks can take longer than 2 months to turn around and come back. So what we didn't want to say is that you obtain it within 2 months. I mean, we can, if you want to shorten that time, that's entirely within your gift. This is just a draft for you to consider.
Just on the thought that if we think it's important immediately, not 2 months' time. And again, that's hopefully so we can discuss that. And secondly, and whilst cost always comes into things, and it will cost the council, have you got a ballpark figure at all?
It's £21.50 per basic check. So the process we've talked about is that the councillor would get the check themselves, so we can send you the link so you can go in and apply, and we would reimburse in relation to that. So it can be shorter than 2 months. I suppose that's entirely for councillors to determine if, timescales.
With the 2-month decision for a particular reason.
Yeah. It was actually aligned with the county council policy on DBS checks, so that was, they had 2 months, I believe, is where it sort of started from in their enhanced policy checks.
Yeah. My personal opinion is that consistency when it comes to policies, so if we've got the policy within the council says 2 months, my instinct is to stick with that, because I know how difficult it is when one policy starts to look different to another when it comes to timescales, especially on things like DBS. So, and I think, but although I can be persuaded, I suppose if somebody else had if we thought we should shorten it to a month or something, but. Go on, Councillor Ellis, if you want to have a comment.
Just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that we do this, but for roles such as social worker, you are required to have a DBS check before you take up your role.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is everybody's already in office now, so and we're not due an election. Well, we're not due an election until 2027, and the policy sets out that this would be carried out now. And obviously if we have by-elections, and we have one obviously potentially coming up shortly in Calverton, so we would have those by-election checks done once that person was elected in. But then the proposal was that we would look at this after, on the next election, this process would be triggered again. So it's a bit. If we adopt that principle, then we would be waiting, I suppose, till the next election. So.
Go on, Councillor Smith.
I think if I were able to propose something, I would propose that we allow 2 weeks grace to allow new councillors to get their feet under the table effectively. But after that, I don't see why we need to delay. Just because the county council delays for 2 months doesn't mean to say they're right.
So, Rosalie, yes. Sorry.
Thank you. Just to confirm for the record that I'm the co-opted member representing the residents, so I am not a councillor. I personally, as somebody who elects in the councillors, would have absolutely no issue with a 2-month timescale. I think it's important to distinguish between mandatory requirements for DBS, such as the social worker example, that Councillor Ellis has referenced, and the fact that it is entirely discretionary. I think it's admirable that councillors want to volunteer themselves for this, but I think putting councillors in a position where they could fall foul of standards policies and find themselves in investigation for something that actually goes above and beyond what is expected of councillors would put people in a difficult position. So, for example, it's entirely reasonable that somebody might be on a 2-week holiday, the policy comes in, and then they've fallen foul of the policy through absolutely no fault of their own. So if that assists councillors, I think 2 months is entirely reasonable for something that's discretionary. And I feel confident that, Gedling residents would share my view. Thank you for volunteering yourselves to do this, but please don't make things impossible for yourselves administratively. I hope that assists.
Are there any other comments at this point? No. Did you want to propose shortening the timescale, or are you happy to go with the 2 months as it stands? Yeah,
I'd like to hear other people's views, to be fair, rather than just go straight to a vote.
No, Councillor Ellis.
It's my view that the 2-month timescale is perfectly reasonable.
Councillor Towsey Hinton.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, we discussed this at the working group, and we thought this was in line with other councils' way of operating. And are we going to be alienating, putting councillors into trouble for something that is really not that compulsory, but because we're making it a policy within the council, are we going to be creating more work for Fran to investigate people because they haven't conformed to do it within the first 2 months? People have got a lot of things going on in their lives, and sometimes to be pressured into 2 weeks to get it done, if they're on holiday, if they've got other commitments, I think 2 months is a reasonable amount of time, personally, as we discussed at the working group. Thank you, Chair.
In which case, are there any other comments or questions regarding the paper before we go to a vote as it stands? No? In which case, then I will make sure we are. There we go. I'll move the recommendation that we note the contents of the report and agree the policy and procedure for disclosure and barring services checks for councillors that were in Appendix 1 are referred to the council for consideration. And I propose that, if I can get a seconder, just Councillor Ellis, and then I'll go for a vote. All those in favour? Say again, sorry. That's what I was going to say, unanimous, so it's carried. And I think the only point left on the agenda was number 5, which is any other item which the Chair considers urgent, and I don't have anything else to to raise for today, so I'll close the meeting. And thank you very much for everyone for their attendance. Thank you all.